They called it a holy mission, a journey to reclaim the sacred. What arrived at Jerusalem in the summer of 1099 was something far darker, a campaign of faith braided with ambition, ending in slaughter and the birth of a new chapter of violence that would echo for centuries. Europe and the Near East, a century into the second millennium, were not strangers to war. But the map that mattered in 1095 had shifted. A decisive blow at Manzikert in 1071 shattered Byzantine confidence. Seljuk Turks pushed into Anatolia, carving provinces from the imperial heartland. The empire that had once dominated the eastern Mediterranean found itself exposed. Territory lost, soldiers stretched thin, a capital threatened. For Byzantium, Manzikert was not merely a battlefield defeat. It was a strategic rupture that invited new forms of intervention and new kinds of actors into the region. West of these struggles, the papacy saw an opening. The church had been consolidating power for generations. A call to arms could be framed as penitence, a renewal of papal leadership, and, crucially, a way to redirect violent energies outward rather than inward. In November 1095 at Clermont, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd and made an appeal that would sweep across Christendom. According to contemporary chroniclers, he spoke of the suffering of Eastern Christians, of lands seized by infidels, and of the spiritual rewards for those who would take the cross. The cry that rose from the assembly, Deus vult, or God wills it, captured an explosive fusion of piety and politics. For many, the promise of indulgence, remission of sins for those who fought, transformed warfare into pilgrimage. This summons fractured into two distinct mobilizations. One was the more orderly aristocratic venture led by princes and seasoned knights, Bohemond of Taranto, Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Tancred, and others. Men who brought retinues, castles, and aims that mixed crusading zeal with territorial ambition. The other was chaotic and raw, the People's Crusade, propelled by charismatic preachers such as Peter the Hermit, drawing peasants, town dwellers, and some lesser nobles who moved by fervor rather than strategy. That fervor, once unleashed, did not remain clean or focused. Before a single ship left for Asia, violence flared at home. From Cologne to Speyer, mobs attacked Jewish communities. Chroniclers record forced baptisms, massacres, and desperate families fleeing with little more than what they could carry. These Rhineland massacres were not peripheral accidents. They foreshadowed how religious zeal could be turned against vulnerable civilians. They were an early warning that this crusade, however framed by clerics, would be influenced as much by mob impulse and local grievances as by papal policy. If Clermont supplied the rhetoric, Constantinople became the crossing point where rhetoric met reality. Alexius I Komnenos, the Byzantine emperor, received envoys and armies with cautious pragmatism. He had requested aid to recover lost lands, but he sought to subordinate any passing crusader host to imperial aims. The nobles agreed to oath-taking ceremonies in which many promised to return any former imperial territories captured from the Turks. Those oaths would later sour relations. The question of who kept what land would become a source of mistrust and accusation. Logistics quickly exposed the limits of medieval armies. Contemporary witnesses and modern historians alike stressed the diversity and scale of the forces. Banners from France, Normandy, Burgundy, Italy, and beyond. Fighters of varying quality. Non-combatant followers. Wagons, women, children, clerics, and camp followers. Estimates of numbers vary widely in the chronicles and among scholars. What is clear is that sustaining such a mass across months of travel through hostile terrain taxed supply lines and morale. Disease, hunger, and desertion cut down the ranks long before the first pitched battles. When the Crusader host entered Anatolia, the campaign's brutality and improvisation accelerated. The 6-week siege of Nicaea in 1097 ended not in a dramatic sack by the Crusaders, but in a negotiated handover. Byzantine diplomacy, backed by secret arrangements, reclaimed the city once Turkish garrisons capitulated. For many Crusaders, the Byzantine handling felt like betrayal. Resentment grew, feeding later divisions. A few weeks later at Dorylaeum, the Crusader cavalry met Seljuk horse archers in a classic clash of tactics. Ambushed and pushed to the brink, the Latin vanguard suffered severely until reinforcements arrived. The battle demonstrated two truths about this war. The Turks' mobility favored hit-and-run tactics that exploited Crusader rigidity, and the Crusaders' ability to organize under pressure could still turn defeat into survival. But survival came at a cost. Men died by the thousands in skirmish and starvation. Entire columns were reduced to half strength before reaching the Syrian frontier. Antioch became the campaign's grim lodestone. The city's siege, which dragged on into the winter of 1098, was a study in endurance, deprivation, and opportunism. Starvation and disease gnawed at the besiegers. Some chroniclers framed the endurance that followed as marked by divine intervention. Visions, alleged relics discovered, and morale-boosting miracles woven into the narrative by clerical writers like Raymond of Aguilares and the anonymous author of the Gesta Francorum. Modern historians treat those miracle stories as part of the Crusades' myth-making, tools to bind a fractious army together, while acknowledging the psychological role miracles played in restoring hope. Internal fractures reached their peak at Antioch. Rival ambitions, accusations of treachery, and the arrival of relief armies complicated an already dire situation. Bohemond, opportunistic and calculated, negotiated local alliances and maneuvered to claim authority once Antioch itself fell. Political settlement followed military victory. The city, after a brutal struggle and a controversial episode in which the Crusaders were nearly destroyed before turning the tables, was taken. The capture brought not only the spoils of war, but also a new equilibrium. Crusader princes now had real holdings in the Levant, and political divisions within the crusade hardened into competing territorial claims. From Antioch, the march south toward Jerusalem intensified the campaign's strain. The land between Antioch and the Holy City was hostile terrain, sprinkled with fortified towns, local Muslim polities, and Christian enclaves. The Crusaders had to contend with heat, lack of water, and the constant harassment of mobile Muslim cavalry. Men who had been rich with expectation now faced a grinding reality. Morale ebbed and flowed with each skirmish, supply convoy, and rumor of reinforcements. By June 1099, the Crusader army encamped outside Jerusalem. The city's defenses were formidable: walls, garrisoned towers, and defenders who understood the stakes. Siegecraft in the late 11th century relied on ladders and scaling, battering rams where available, siege towers where wood and time permitted, and mining, undermining walls to collapse them. Chroniclers describe the methodical preparations, the construction of engines, the lining up of troops, and the probing attacks designed to find a weakness. The siege itself was relatively short, lasting a few weeks. Yet its brevity does not lessen its intensity. On July 15, 1099, after assaults and a concerted escalation of pressure, Crusader forces breached sections of the walls. What followed is the darkest chapter of this campaign. Contemporary Latin chroniclers, most notably Albert of Aachen and the anonymous Gesta Francorum, offer harrowing accounts of what transpired in the city once the defenders were overwhelmed. According to these sources, violence spread through the streets. Soldiers hunted down those they believed to be enemies, the dead littered thoroughfares, and places of worship were violated. Jewish and Muslim civilians, along with Eastern Christians perceived as collaborators or simply as residents of the city, suffered terribly. Chroniclers wrote in tones of triumph and horror, sometimes indistinguishably, reflecting the moral confusion at the heart of the crusade. Modern historians approach these accounts with caution and with an attempt to balance contemporaneous testimony against likely exaggeration. Estimates of the number killed vary. Chroniclers tended to amplify spectacle. That said, there is a broad consensus that the massacre was real and vast by medieval standards. Thousands are likely to have died. The violence included targeted killings in mosques and neighborhoods where armed resistance had taken place. Looting and the taking of captives followed. The city's fall became a moment of apocalyptic significance for Crusaders. The holy goal attained, but at the price of civilian blood. It is important to resist facile narratives. Some medieval chroniclers framed the slaughter as divine retribution against the city's defenders. Others celebrated victory as a miracle granted to the faithful. Yet the more sober interpretation is that a complex mix of factors produced the carnage. Prolonged dehumanizing siege conditions, the breakdown of command and control at critical moments, ideological justifications that made killing appear righteous, and the cold arithmetic of reward where booty and land were immediately redistributed among leaders and followers. One striking example of immediate political consequence was the emergence of new polities carved from the conquered landscape. Baldwin of Boulogne, who had departed the main army earlier and carved out his own path, seized control of Edessa and later became king in Jerusalem. Bohemond held Antioch. Godfrey accepted a leading role in the nascent kingdom of Jerusalem, declining the title of king in favor of a more ambiguous dignity. But his authority helped establish a Latin presence that would endure for decades. These settlements institutionalized conquest. The Crusades' religious rhetoric yielded lasting political borders and a colonial structure in the Levant. The human cost went beyond the battlefield and the immediate victims of sieges. The Crusades' aftermath rearranged populations, disrupted trade, and deepened enmities. For Jewish communities in Europe, the Rhineland massacres remained a scar. For Muslims and Eastern Christians, the Latin principalities became an intrusive and often predatory presence. The First Crusade created precedents, military orders, holy warfare as sanctioned by papal authority, the use of indulgences to mobilize lay violence that would be invoked again and again. Reflection on these events must keep two truths in tension. First, many participants believed they acted from sincere piety. The language of pilgrimage and penitence was real. Men and women undertook terrible hardships convinced of spiritual reward. Second, belief did not render their actions innocent. Political calculation, territorial ambition, greed, and the brutal realities of pre-modern warfare shaped decisions as much as devout intent. The massacre at Jerusalem is not a simple story of divine mandate or pure malevolence. It is a narrative of moral collision, where religious rhetoric furnished permission and human ambitions and failures supplied the means. Memory amplified both miracle and massacre. The same chronicles that justified or glorified the conquest also recorded prayer, fasting, and desperate appeals to God.
Centuries later, historiography would sift these records for patterns of causation. Manzakurt's shock, papal politics, mob zeal at home, the logistical limits of crusading, Byzantine crusader tensions, opportunistic princes, and the decisive moment at Jerusalem. Each element contributed to an outcome that was less a single inevitable event and more a confluence of contingency and choice. What does the First Crusade leave us with? It left political structures, the counties and kingdoms of the Latin East, whose very existence normalized a form of territorial crusading. It left a sharpened Christian-Muslim animus that was replayed in later centuries, from subsequent crusades to reciprocal raids and retaliations. And it left moral questions that remain uncomfortable. How to reconcile acts committed in the name of religion with the suffering of innocence. How collective belief can be marshaled into violence. And how power and faith can become indistinguishable when victory is at stake. The story of 1099 resists tidy closure. It is a tale of exalted language and grim reality, of vows sworn and oaths betrayed, of prayer and pillage. The capture of Jerusalem marked a high point of Crusader aspiration, yet the manner in which that mark was achieved stained the enterprise with a legacy of brutality that successive generations would inherit and reinterpret. As one looks back on this bloody quest for Jerusalem, the necessary judgment is neither to erase religious motive nor to excuse the carnage. It is to name both, to recognize the genuine piety that motivated many, and to condemn without equivocation the violence inflicted on civilians and communities. History here is not moral theater where heroes and villains appear conveniently assigned. It is a complex, human story of faith entangled with ambition, strategy, and horror. If this account has drawn you into the tangled, difficult history of the First Crusade, and you want deeper looks at individual battles, primary chroniclers, or the archaeology of the Latin East, subscribe and follow the channel to explore more evidence-driven narratives. Support helps us continue to bring careful history to a wider audience. In the end, the fall of Jerusalem in 1099 remains emblematic, a city reclaimed by some at the cost of many, and a milestone that transformed medieval Christendom's engagement with the world beyond its borders. What began as a call to penitence became a template for religiously sanctioned conquest. It is a history that asks uncomfortable questions about the uses of faith, the mechanics of power, and the human price of zeal. Remembering it means holding both the motives and the consequences in view, not to settle scores, but to understand how acts once justified in God's name reshaped peoples and regions for centuries to come.